In the shadows of medieval cities, some women had no other way to survive. With no work, no protection from the church, and no help from the town, they were left with only one option: to sell their bodies. This video uncovers the forgotten reality of prostitution in the Middle Ages, a world ruled by shame, danger, and strict control. These women were judged, used, and then erased from history, but their stories deserve to be told. Life for women in medieval Europe was incredibly difficult, especially for those without financial support or a male protector. Most women couldn't own property, vote, or secure well-paying jobs. Their futures were largely dictated by the men in their lives, fathers, brothers, or husbands. If a woman lost her husband in war, or if her father passed away without providing her with a dowry, she often found herself in a position of complete vulnerability. Single women had few options. They might work as servants, weavers, washerwomen, or even attempt to become nuns. But these roles were not available to everyone, and the pay was so low that it often didn't cover even the most basic needs. Furthermore, many women were turned away from religious life if they lacked the proper background or couldn't afford the associated fees. Often left many women with no choice but to turn to prostitution. Not out of desire, but out of sheer necessity. Imagine a widow with no children, or a young girl whose village was destroyed during a war. Without a home, family, or food, prostitution might have been her only means of survival. This was not an isolated case. It happened throughout towns and cities in medieval Europe. During times of famine or after battles, the number of women entering the sex trade would often increase dramatically. In some cities, local authorities even forced women into prostitution as a means of controlling the growing population of poor or homeless women. A clear example comes from 14th century in Paris, where many refugee women fleeing the countryside during the 100 Years' War and found themselves in the city's brothels. Similarly, in Florence, officials observed that during the plague years, the number of women turning to sex work increased significantly as they struggled to survive after losing their families. As towns and cities expanded during the Middle Ages, local governments began to view prostitution not only as a moral issue, but also as an aspect of urban life that required regulation. In many cases, prostitution became semi-official, with city governments taking steps to control the trade. City councils frequently opened or licensed public brothels. These were regulated establishments where women could legally work, but they were subject to strict rules. The city benefited financially from these establishments through taxes and rent, turning brothels into a source of income. Women working in these brothels had little freedom. They were restricted to certain streets with fixed working hours, and they were required to serve a minimum number of clients. City regulations also enforced rules about hygiene and behavior. For instance, women were expected to keep themselves and their clothing clean, and violence within brothels was prohibited, though it still occurred regularly. A famous example comes from London, where brothels were prohibited within the city limits, but they were permitted outside of city walls, just across the River Thames. This area was outside the city's jurisdiction, and surprisingly, the brothels there were protected by the Bishop of Winchester, a powerful church official. In southern Europe, the approach was slightly different. Many towns constructed official brothels within their walls but ensured that prostitution outside these establishments was punished. This system allowed local governments to regulate who could engage in the trade and where they could operate. While this system may sound well organized, it was far from flawless. It allowed city leaders to keep prostitution concealed and under control, but it didn't provide real protection for the women involved. However, compared to the hazardous life of street-based sex work, being employed in a legal brothel at least offered some degree of stability. The Catholic Church had a complex and somewhat contradictory stance on prostitution. While it officially condemned prostitution as a mortal sin, it also viewed it as a lesser evil. believing it helped prevent even worse sins. Theologians such as Thomas Aquinas argued that public brothels were necessary to prevent more severe crimes, like rape or sodomy. They contended that regulating prostitution was better than allowing it to occur without any control. Despite this, the Church continually urged these women to repent and seek forgiveness for their sins. There was a persistent push for them to change their ways and lead a more spiritual life. Women were often made to feel ashamed of their profession and were encouraged to seek redemption. Some monasteries went a step further by providing women with an opportunity to leave their lives of prostitution. These women were welcomed into the monastery, where they could seek redemption and begin a new, religious life. Building on the Church's efforts to provide prostitutes with a path to redemption, Saint Mary Magdalene emerged as a central figure in this narrative. It's important to note that her story is largely based on legend. According to Christian tradition, she was depicted as a former sinner who repented and turned to God. This story became a powerful symbol used by the Church to encourage prostitutes to change their ways. By the 14th century, the Church began establishing Magdalene houses, institutions specifically designed to assist women who wished to leave prostitution behind. These places offered refuge, spiritual renewal, and a chance for women to transform their lives. As part of their social stigma, prostitutes were often required to wear distinctive clothing or accessories to set them apart from respectable women. The public marking of prostitutes served as a visible sign of shame, indicating that these women were part of a marginalized and disreputable group. For example, in Vienna, prostitutes were required to wear a yellow scarf, which clearly indicated their profession and made them easily identifiable. In Zurich, prostitutes wore a red hat, while in other places, such as parts of France, they were marked with a green stripe on their veil. These visible markers helped distinguish these women from the rest of society. In some cases, women in prostitution were also forced to cut their hair short or even shave it off completely. This was especially common during certain periods and in specific regions, where it was believed to be a way to make them stand out. A woman's hair was often considered a symbol of her dignity and virtue, so by cutting it, these women publicly marked themselves as lost or fallen. The visible signs marking them were not the only challenges they faced. Their daily lives were even harsher. Life of sex worker in medieval Europe was far from glamorous. These women lived in poverty, enduring long, grueling hours of work. They were frequently subjected to violence, both from clients and from the authorities. The lack of basic health care worsened their suffering. Disease was a constant threat, and without adequate medical care, many women contracted sexually transmitted infections. It wasn't until the 16th century that cities like Venice and Paris began implementing regular medical checks to combat the spread of diseases like syphilis. Even then, these efforts were insufficient to address the dire conditions in which the women worked. Prostitutes were frequently present with armies, especially during the Crusades. They were considered essential for maintaining the morale of the troops. Soldiers, far from home and enduring long periods of hardship, often relied on prostitutes for comfort and distraction. The belief was that providing these services would help keep the soldiers focused on their mission and prevent frustration or rebellion caused by pent-up desires. However, not all military leaders welcomed the presence of these women. Some commanders, focused on maintaining strict discipline and purity in their ranks, ordered them to leave the camps. Richard the Lionheart, known for his discipline, attempted to exclude prostitutes from his camps. He believed their presence would undermine the focus of his army on the religious and military goals of the crusade. During the Third Crusade, he actively sought to ban prostitutes from his camp, fearing they would erode the morale and discipline of his troops. In some regions, guilds of prostitutes were established, with their own rules and even efforts to defend the rights of their members. For instance, in Paris, there was a well-documented guild that had a formalized structure and protected certain rights for its members, including negotiating with brothel owners. These guilds offered some degree of organization and protection for women working in the sex trade. They ensured that their members were treated fairly by brothel owners or clients and helped negotiate better working conditions. These guilds were a distinctive feature of medieval European society, as they provided prostitutes with a collective voice, something that many other workers at the time lacked. The profession also had a clear hierarchy. At the bottom were street prostitutes who worked independently, often in public spaces. Above them were women employed in regulated brothels, like those in London and Venice, where conditions were somewhat better but still difficult. At the top of the hierarchy were the courtesans. These women were highly skilled in art, music, and conversation, and they often mingled with the elite. For example, Veronica Franco, a renowned Venetian courtesan in the 16th century, was celebrated for her intellect and beauty. She attracted the attention of influential men, including nobles and poets. Some courtesans even achieved wealth and influence that was rare for women of that era. In 1494, syphilis appeared in Naples, and it quickly spread across Europe. This disease, often associated with prostitution, led to growing fear and stigmatization of the sex trade. As syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases became more widespread, prostitution came to be viewed not only as a moral issue, but also as a public health risk. By the early 16th century, many cities started to link prostitution with the spread of disease. The church and authorities reacted by enforcing stricter regulations and even closing brothels. In cities like Augsburg and Nuremberg in Germany, during the period of the Reformation, public houses were shut down as part of broader efforts to morally cleanse society. The Reformation, led by figures like Martin Luther, was also a time when the Catholic Church's influence over everyday life was challenged, and as part of this religious and social upheaval, the practice of prostitution was increasingly outlawed in some cities. The effort to close brothels was often rooted in moral and religious concerns, as well as fears of the spread of disease. However, despite these efforts, the demand for prostitution didn't disappear, leading to a shift to more clandestine forms of sex work, which were even harder for authorities to control. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've made it to the end, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Your support really helps a lot. See you in next video.